Muy buenos días, ¿cómo están? Estamos en una nueva sesión de la Asociación Argentina de Ética y Compliance, la Comisión renombrada de Logística y Abastecimiento. Algunos nos conocían como la Comisión de Agroindustria y Alimentos. Bueno, no, ya no. Hemos evolucionado, hemos crecido, y ahora estamos dedicados a logística y abastecimiento, sin descuidar, obviamente, la industria que veníamos atendiendo. Javier, ¿cómo estás? Buen día.
Buen día, ¿cómo están todos? Sí, creemos que lo interesante es ampliar un poco el espectro, el scope, y por eso que también ahora entonces abarcamos todo lo que tiene que ver con logística de abastecimiento, que nos parece que además de los alimentos y la agroindustria tiene otra serie de industrias, y nos parece que es muy relevante para todo el compliance. Bueno, y tenemos el gusto de tener un orador de lujo. ¿Lo vas a presentar, Gustavo?
Totalmente. Jeffry Lehtman, un amigo de la casa, hace muchos años que nos conocemos, que hemos trabajado juntos, hemos tenido la oportunidad, lo más importante, de comer un par de asados juntos, así que es un gusto enorme. Jeff está en Washington, y desde allá nos está conectando. Algo importante, Jeff va a dar la presentación y la conversación va a ser en inglés, pero entiende perfectamente y habla muy bien español. No se anima y estamos empujándolo a que se anime, pero la charla va a ser en español, en inglés. Comprende muy bien, con lo cual todas las preguntas que tengan, comentarios y demás, pueden hacerlos tranquilamente en español, que él los va a entender muy bien. Para presentarlo, Jeff es socio del estudio Miller Chevalier. Tiene más de 20 años de experiencia asesorando a empresas multinacionales, locales, instituciones financieras, directores y ejecutivos de esas organizaciones, en temas de compliance corporativo, investigaciones internas, la defensa de asuntos de lo que llamamos white collar crime, y especialmente, y con mucho foco especialmente claro, frente a autoridades de los Estados Unidos y varios países de América Latina. Antes de unirse a Miller Chevalier, Jeff fue Senior Regional Counsel en Citibank, donde tenía responsabilidad para temas de litigios y compliance transfronterizo, especialmente con foco en Latinoamérica, y también fue fiscal en el Departamento de Justicia, con responsabilidad de colaboración internacional en asuntos penales entre Estados Unidos y distintos países de América Latina. Jeff ha sido reconocido por varias publicaciones especializadas, por su amplia experiencia en América Latina, y es algo que también podemos disfrutar, y esperemos también podamos, y seguramente vamos a disfrutar en este encuentro de hoy. Jeff, vamos a cambiar al inglés. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you, Javier, and most especially, thank you very much to the Asociación Argentina de Ética y Compliance. It is a privilege to be here today with the association, and of course, a great honor to see my friends Gustavo and Javier. And although I cannot see everybody else who is participating, undoubtedly there are other friends and familiar faces that have joined, and of course, new friends that I have not met previously. So it really is an honor and a privilege to be here. And of course, thank you to the renamed commission for having invited me today. I have a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share at the beginning, but as Gustavo and Javier said, I really hope that this conversation can be interactive and that we can interest people who are participating in asking questions that are most relevant to your day-to-day lives in terms of what you see and what you encounter in your professional responsibilities. The focus for today's conversation is going to be on third-party due diligence and the importance of third-party due diligence, particularly from the perspective of, in English, what we call logistics and sourcing, but also more generally what is the importance of a company implementing a third-party due diligence program, and what are some practical steps for how a company can start to implement its program and indeed refine or modify its program over time. So the most important thing I will say is to urge everybody to please put questions to us as we go along, and we will do our best to answer the questions that are raised. In terms of starting to talk about third-party due diligence, I always begin from the proposition of why is it important? Why do we even worry about having a third-party due diligence program at a company? And as Gustavo and Javier knows, I'm very fond of putting things into lists. Top 3 reasons, top 5 reasons. So I'm going to start there. In terms of why for any corporation, whether it is a local company based in Argentina, whether it's a company based in Argentina whose shares are traded in the US, whether it's a subsidiary or an affiliate of a large multinational, regardless of the profile of a company, why is it important for organizations today to have a third-party due diligence program? And to me, I start from perhaps the most naive perspective, which is third-party due diligence is by itself inherently part of a corporation or part of an organization being a good corporate citizen in the market. That is to say, third-party due diligence, knowing with whom a company conducts business, is part of making sure that business is conducted on the basis of transparency, quality, and value, and not simply on the basis of relationships, nepotism, or corruption. I know that sounds quite philosophical. I know it sounds quite sometimes gringo, but I think it is at a very fundamental level, it is a philosophical reason in terms of why companies spend the time and spend the resources developing a third-party due diligence program. So we start from the philosophical and then we become a little bit more practical, which is to say, from a more practical perspective, third-party due diligence at the end protects corporate assets, protects companies' values by creating a process that can prevent and detect third parties, and sometimes third parties together with internal company personnel, from taking advantage of the company, basically from engaging in internal fraud, embezzlement, kickbacks, and other forms of misconduct that essentially take or steal money or assets that properly belong to the organization. So at a much more practical level, third-party due diligence, knowing who the third parties are that your company operates with, allows a company to prevent and detect those types of issues. And if that reason were not practical enough, perhaps the most practical or most direct reason why companies invest in third-party due diligence is because having not just a compliance program generally, but specifically a third-party risk management plan is perhaps the best defense, the greatest way to protect a company, its directors, its managers, and its employees from legal, regulatory, and reputational risk associated with conduct, perhaps misconduct, taken by third parties that are acting for the company. And in many jurisdictions around the world, I will limit my comments to the US, although I pretend to be a lawyer in many jurisdictions around the world. I really am only licensed to practice in the US. From a US perspective, third parties, agents, consultants, intermediaries who act on behalf of the company, their conduct and their misconduct can be attributed to, that is to say that the company and its people can be held responsible for misconduct of the third party from a legal perspective. And so developing a third-party compliance program that includes taking reasonable and prudent steps to understand who the third parties are that you're doing business with, and being able to demonstrate the existence of a third-party plan is the most significant way to mitigate risk if a third party does in fact engage in misconduct while it is performing services for the company. Said differently, you cannot stop bad people from doing bad things, but you can try to demonstrate that you had a program or a plan in place to try to detect and prevent third parties from engaging in misconduct when they're working for the business. So from a theoretical and from a practical perspective, those are sort of what I perceive as the most important reasons or the most important drivers for a company investing the time and resources to having a third-party due diligence program. So where to begin? And I recognize that there are many different organizations represented here today. So some of this may seem very early stage or very fundamental. Some of it may seem more advanced. I'm trying to sort of essentially limit my comments to those items that I think are most important to the broadest spectrum or broadest scope of companies. From a US perspective, when we think about third-party risk management, we always, at least for the last couple of years, we have started our conversation from looking at the guidance that US authorities have published. And again, from a US regulatory perspective, and I think, I say US, but I think because the US historically has been perhaps the most aggressive in enforcing ethics and integrity laws globally, the US guidance and the US perspective from the authorities here is often perceived to be guidance that is relevant to multinational corporations. The US guidance really, in the last couple of years, the most important aspect of that has been a memorandum published by the Justice Department in the US that relates to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And if you have not seen that memorandum, you should see the memo because it is a very, very valuable tool for not just for legal and compliance people, but for members of management, from procurement officers, from sourcing people, for virtually anybody in an organization that shares responsibility for compliance. That memorandum is a really useful tool because it goes through in very clear language the expectations of the US authorities for corporate compliance programs. And one of the key elements, one of the items that is highlighted in that memorandum is the importance of third-party management, third-party risk management and due diligence. And although the concept in that memo is all about risk-based due diligence and making sure that a diligence program or a diligence plan is driven by companies' risks, it really comes down to 4 different elements. Again, I said 3 items before, now I'm moving to 4 elements. And the 4 items that the DOJ and the US, and that as a result, when I talk to clients that I focus on the most are the following. So let me go through the 4 elements and then I will stop and we can start having more of a discussion. In terms of designing a third-party due diligence program, the most important element is what I call KYP. In banking or in finance, we always talk about KYC, know your client or know your customer. And with respect to third-party due diligence, we talk about KYP, which is in English, know your partner. And although that can sound fancy, knowing your partner really means at the end of the day, understanding the background, understanding the qualifications, and understanding the relationships that the third party you are hiring for your company has. What are his or her qualifications to perform the job? What is the company's associations? What is their prior experience, their prior history performing these types of services for the company? And what types of relationships does that third party have, both good and potentially risky? Are there very helpful, beneficial relationships for the company that this third party brings with them? Or are there relationships with the public sector that, while they can be perceived as a positive, they could also pose risks from an ethics and compliance perspective for the company? So who is the third party? What are their qualifications? And very importantly, who referred the third party? How did the third party arrive to the company? Is it somebody that is known to the management team or known to employees? Or is it a third party that was referred to the company by a government official that perhaps by itself can present risk to the company? So the first element is KYP, or know your partner. The second element for a successful due diligence program is know the business rationale. Why is the company hiring a third party for the types of services that are being contemplated here? The company should know, as part of its plan and part of its program, what is the justification for bringing in a third party? And said differently, why can we not perform the same corporate function by using internal resources? Why is it necessary to bring in a third party and impose somebody external into the internal flow? Can a company not sell its goods and services directly? Is it required that you sell your goods and services through a third party sales agent or distributor or supplier? Or in a different scenario, can the company not obtain a license or a permit directly? Is it required for a third party to obtain that license or permit? And if so, what is the reason? What is the justification for having a third party? So we have know your partner, know the business rationale. And the third item really is know the compensation structure. And again, these are all elements that I think are fundamental to having a third-party due diligence program. What is the structure by which a company will compensate a third party? Are the services that the third party will provide described clearly in a written agreement? Not all goods and services being provided by a third party all times are going to be in a written agreement. I understand that. But those that present the most risk from a compliance perspective, those types of third-party arrangements should be memorialized in a written agreement. And that written agreement should very clearly delineate or articulate the types of services to be performed and the basis for determining the compensation for the third party. So before hiring that third party, does the company understand the compensation structure well enough? Has the company actually conducted some element of analysis to make sure that the compensation being paid to the third party is both consistent with the industry and consistent with the geographic location in which those services are being performed? And perhaps most importantly, what are the incentives to the third party? And do the incentives align with the types of services that are being provided? So, for example, if a third-party gestor is being retained to assist in obtaining a license or a permit that is relatively simple, relatively straightforward, but the company has determined that it needs the services of a gestor, is the gestor being paid on the basis of their time and any services being provided, or does the agreement with the gestor provide a success fee that will compensate the gestor if, for example, they're able to obtain a permit in less than 10 days or less than 30 days? That element of a success fee by itself is not inherently illegal. It does not mean that the company is trying to pay a bribe or that the company is trying to engage in some sort of illicit activity. But the existence of that structure, the existence of that type of success fee is a red flag, is an alert that needs to be analyzed to make sure the company is comfortable with the incentives that are being created and that there are controls implemented to make sure that those red flags do not become a compliance issue. And then finally, we talked about know your partner, know the business rationale, know the compensation structure. The final element that I would say is monitoring. Making sure that third-party due diligence does not just begin and end when a third party is brought into the company, is onboarded. And I know we will talk a little bit about common mistakes that we see in the region. One of the most common mistakes that I have seen in my career is the idea of third-party due diligence ends when the third party signs a contract. While that may be technically true that the due diligence process ends, really the risk to the company is only beginning once the third party is retained. And so the fourth element that is most fundamental in my view is making sure that a company has a process that monitors the activities, stays current on its due diligence, audits the conduct of third parties, if it can, trains its third parties to make sure that through the entire life cycle or the entire relationship with the third party, that the company is continuing to keep its eyes open to make sure that the conduct of the third party is aligned with the company's expectations for ethics and integrity. These are the general principles that I would talk about. I know we are going to talk in even more detail and specifics in terms of how does a company go about basically taking those concepts and making them into reality. But at the end of the day, I would say there is no secret recipe, right? In English, we say there is no secret sauce. There are no two programs from a third-party due diligence perspective that are exactly the same. And at the end of the day, developing a third-party due diligence program comes down to understanding the risks that a company faces in its business and its operations, and recognizing that not every company is, I used to say General Electric, but General Electric is probably not the best example. Not every company is Google. Not every company is the largest of the multinationals. Many companies, are homegrown companies in a single jurisdiction. Other companies may be in one or two jurisdictions whose shares are traded. Others may be big global technology companies. Every company's risk profile is different, and as a result, the compliance functions, and specifically for purposes of today, third-party due diligence is going to look differently at every company. In terms of the region itself, and I promise I will stop talking after this one comment. One of the things that I have seen as I have spent my career in Argentina, but more generally in the region, is the idea that not necessarily that there is resistance to compliance or resistance to third-party due diligence, although to be sure, sometimes there is resistance. But in most situations, what I have found is there is a certain mystery or mysticism around the concept of compliance and due diligence on the part of senior management and directors of companies. You know, people that do this day to day, like many of the people on this call, we use phrases like due diligence, compliance, risk-based, and in my experience, sometimes those phrases or those words are just perceived as costs or expenses, and very significant costs and expenses by those who are responsible for maintaining a budget within an organization. And I think part of the challenge for the people that work in the compliance space is to try to take away some of that mysticism from compliance and from third-party due diligence, and educate those stakeholders that at the end of the day, although we use fancy terms to describe some of these concepts, we are talking ultimately about putting in place controls and procedures that are intended to add value, to be incremental to the company's value by protecting the organization and by protecting its people. And that at the end of the day, compliance is not just a philosophical construct, but is a practical one that is intended to be protective of the company and its people. So I have spoken way more than I typically speak in one breath. So let me stop there and perhaps kick it back to Javier and Gustavo to see if there are specific directions you would want us to go, or there are specific questions.
Javier?
Gustavo, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jeff. Very, very clear. And we have a question that we responded in the chat regarding the memo that you mentioned from the DOJ. And we do have a number of questions, and I know that people may have attendees that may have many questions. So feel free to put them in the chat, and we will be reading them. But Jeff, in our experience, and you mentioned something, many companies talk about third parties, and when we go to that, many of them got scared because they say, hey, we have thousands of third parties, vendors, providers. Who are the specific third parties we are talking about? Are we talking about all our vendors, our huge change, value change, or there are some specific people, companies, entities, gestores? And it's funny to see that there's no translation for gestores. And are we talking about a specific group of third parties, or are we talking about all of them?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Gustavo. Sometimes in my experience, what I see is companies become paralyzed by the diversity of third parties with which they do business. And they become sometimes that the sheer volume or the sheer number of third parties prevents a company from moving forward with a program. The thing that I would say, the most important thing first is to make sure that a company first understands who are the third parties that you do business with. Before you start designing categories and designing a third-party program, it's important to know who are the different types of third parties with which a company conducts business, and making sure that the company is using a consistent terminology. You would be shocked at how many times I get on a phone call with compliance officers or with general counsels or with senior management teams, and there is no common understanding of the terminology used with respect to third parties. Business partners, vendors, suppliers, distributors, the amount of terminology is endless. And what I always say to clients is stop. we need to develop a common understanding. First, let us define the different categories of third parties. Before we can design due diligence, we have to understand who are the third parties. And once there is a common understanding of who are the third parties, and there is a common terminology to describe those third parties, then we can start designing what are the appropriate due diligence steps with respect to each of those third parties. So to answer your question more directly, Gustavo, especially for companies that are earlier stage or that are traditional family or companies or privately owned conglomerates, there is some hesitation to do due diligence on literally every third party that the company does business with. And what I would say is a really key part of developing third-party due diligence is putting the third parties into different risk-based categories. So I would use the number 4, which is, who are the vendors and suppliers? If we are talking about vendors and suppliers, that is companies that operate at an arm's length, that are selling goods or services to the company. Everything from providing health insurance to the company's employees, to the person that shows up to paint the offices or to do construction at the offices. True third-party vendors and suppliers, because they are not representing the company or they're not operating in the name of the company, the risk from an ethics and compliance perspective is quite low. They are not engaging on behalf of the company, they're providing a good and service. And so, again, depending on the size and the nature of the company, I would say those pose a lowest risk. And perhaps from a commercial perspective, a company wants to have an approach to conduct a credit review or a credit profile on those third parties to make sure that they are worthy of doing business. But from a compliance perspective, my view is a company, particularly those that have limited resources, probably shouldn't spend a lot of time or money doing due diligence on those third parties. So that's one category. The second category that I would say is consultants. So consultants that are interacting with other internal personnel or that are interacting with other private actors. So think about hiring an IT consultant or hiring a geologist if you're a mining company. Any type of consultant that is going to be interacting with either internal or external personnel, but where those external people are not public officials. Those types of consultants pose, I would say, a slightly higher risk profile than vendors and suppliers that we just talked about, but still are not posing very significant ethics and compliance risk. So perhaps for those types of consultants, you decide to run an online screening or a background check on those consultants. And you may ask them to be subject to your compliance policies and procedures and execute a certification that says they will agree to your company's compliance policies and procedures. And perhaps you ask those people to sign a written agreement, which I would suggest, that in which they confirm that they will comply with your compliance program. But again, if you're hiring an IT consultant or you're hiring a part-time person to be a receptionist, those people are still not presenting significant compliance risk. Where you start to see more significant compliance risk is in the second two categories. The third one is business partners and joint venture partners. Those companies and individuals who may very well represent your company or sell products or services on behalf of your company. And that's where you start to get into this whole concept of business partners, distributors, resellers, whatever we want to call them, depending on the sector, those third parties start to pose more significant compliance risk for your company. So by virtue of having a due diligence program that is based on that risk, you want to start to increase the level of scrutiny or the level of due diligence on those third parties. So for example, you may decide to do the exact same thing we just talked about with respect to internal consultants, but in addition, you may ask those business partners or joint venture partners to complete a due diligence questionnaire, so that you make sure you understand and that you have in writing what types of internal controls and procedures does that third party have. What types of relationships does that third party have? Who are the managers and beneficial owners of that third party that you're about to do business with? Are you about to, for example, get into business with a third party business partner that is owned by a government official? And so you will be making payments to a third party owned by a government official, and that company in turn is doing business with the government. Well, if that's the case, obviously you have some significant compliance risk. So making sure that there is a due diligence questionnaire where you receive the information on that business partner and you can conduct some additional due diligence or additional screening on that third party, its owners and shareholders. And then finally, the fourth category, and I know, Gustavo, this is probably a longer answer than you wanted, but the fourth category is agents, gestores, intermediaries, consultants that have the authority to act on behalf of the company with respect to or vis-a-vis public officials. And in here, obviously, herein lies the most significant compliance risk for the company and its people. And correspondingly, here's where I would say, together with business partners and joint venture partners, here's where I say companies, regardless of size, ought to be allocating the most significant compliance resources from a due diligence standpoint. So everything I said with respect to business partners and joint ventures applies here, but perhaps in addition to receiving information from a due diligence questionnaire, you may also decide, because this third party is going to present the highest risk, you may decide to check references, obtain references and check references on this third party. You may decide to conduct a compliance interview with the third party's owners or the third party's managers. And you may decide that you're going to subject or require that that third party be trained in your compliance program, including your expectations on anti-bribery and corruption. And indeed, you may insist that that third party, when it goes to sign a written agreement, agree that your company will have rights to audit or conduct an audit on that third party and how it conducts business on your behalf. So you may decide to negotiate audit rights in the written agreement that you have with that third party. So Gustavo, very long way of answering your question, but I think to put it in brief, you know, there are many different categories of third parties, and for companies that have a more limited budget or limited resources, going through this exercise of defining the categories and then designing due diligence based on the higher risk categories is a more cost-effective, cost-efficient way to implement a plan or a program.
Jeff, I have a follow-up question on this matter. The issue is, you mentioned this exercise. I think it's a kind of compliance third-party risk assessment or the like. What is that? What you expect from the business leaders, the boards, in terms of the participation, direct or indirect participation on this exercise? And maybe an additional question, which are the most common pitfalls that you see that will maybe create some liability in the future?
Thanks, Javier. So in terms of the board and senior business leaders, I think the most important, this will sound, I understand this will sound very cliche, but I'm going to say it anyways. But the most important thing for senior business leaders is to actually show a commitment that the third-party due diligence matters. The famous tone from the top that we always talk about. And when I say tone from the top, I do not just mean that the CEO signs a letter at the front of the code of conduct and then forgets about compliance for the rest of the time she is the CEO. I mean a real commitment to show through words and through actions that third-party diligence matters, and that from the senior management team and from the board, that this is a way to protect the company's value and protect the company's franchise. So tone at the top, commitment, but perhaps most importantly, and this is where I see a lot of mistakes. A lot of times senior management or a board will set the right tone. They will say, we are committed to compliance, we are committed to third-party risk management. And then what happens when the CEO is under pressure to get a permit or a license? He or she then decides that they don't have the patience to wait to go through the procurement process or to wait for the due diligence program to run its course. And they decide, okay, we're going to make an exception. And then that one exception becomes 5 exceptions. And the CEO and the CFO and the COO and the chairman of the board, all of a sudden, the exceptions become larger than the rule. And where I have seen on due diligence, the most situations that have created liability is when the senior management team decides that the rules only apply to people lower on the chain and not to them. And look, I am not so naive to believe that there aren't instances where an exception makes sense. There are clearly business imperatives where you have to make an exception and where you can justify an exception. But where management and where the board sees themselves as outside the scope of the compliance program, and where they can circumvent or avoid procurement or compliance, that is where the risk kicks in, and that is where I have seen the most significant liability.
Jeff, we have a question from people, and it's connected with one that we had, and it's if you consider that omitting or not running a due diligence can disqualify your defense in the eventual case of an issue with that third party. And if we can say that, okay, it's a third party, they have nothing to do with us, it's an external entity, we told them what they have to do, so we have nothing to do. What are the terms of, what are the consequences in terms of responsibility, liability, and defense in the case of an issue?
Yeah, the short answer is closing your eyes and your ears is not a defense. Because it's a third party does not excuse the company or its people from liability. Again, I want to be careful. I'm talking about from a U.S. perspective. And it is a similar situation in many other jurisdictions. But let me describe how this plays out in let's say an FCPA investigation in the US. So you have a company from Argentina whose shares are traded in the US or who conducts business in the US. And so they are subject to FCPA jurisdiction. If there is an investigation about a company's conduct that relates to a third party, the company will, and as I said at the beginning, the most significant way to defend the company in that situation is to be able to show up and not just explain, but demonstrate and show that the company had a properly functioning compliance program and that it conducted robust, real due diligence on its third parties. And despite the company's best efforts, despite what steps the company took to try to prevent the third party engaged in misconduct. So it is not a free pass, which means if you show up in the US in a US investigation and say we conducted due diligence, that does not mean that DOJ would stop its investigation and would not try to bring charges, but it is a mitigating factor. It is the strongest mitigating force to be able to try to persuade or convince authorities that despite the company's best efforts, somebody who is working outside the company engaged in misconduct. If you show up to the same meeting or if you show up to the same conversation and you say, look, the third party knew that we had a code of conduct, but we did not conduct any due diligence on them, I can promise you that the reception or the response you will get from the DOJ and from the SEC, if you're an issuer in the US, is not going to be very positive. So at the end, it's all based on a spectrum. How can you best position the company at the moment of an investigation? And the best way to do that is to demonstrate the due diligence plan. I will say, this is not just an issue of US authorities, obviously. Other local authorities and other jurisdictions, plenty of them bring investigations, but it is also not just regulators or enforcers. There are many situations where other stakeholders outside of the company may ask similar questions. Your external auditors, for example, may ask questions. External auditors, especially those that have multinational clients, have their own independent obligations. And external auditors ask many, many questions about internal controls and about a company's compliance program and investigations. And if you are in the conversation with your external auditor, a company should expect that they will get similar questions on what types of due diligence programs they have in place. And if there's an internal investigation, what due diligence did the company engage in before hiring that third party? So it's not just the big bad Justice Department in the US. There are other regulators and there are other stakeholders that are likely to ask similar questions as well.
Jeff, there is another question from the audience that says, what is a fair compensation structure for a gestor or a consultant? I think that you touch base a bit, but I think it would be interesting to hear your recommendations on that.
Yeah. So I'm going to give the most lawyerly answer that I can possibly give, which is it depends. So much of the compensation conversation depends on the jurisdiction. You know, what is the local practice in the jurisdiction, and what are the services that are being provided? In other words, you know, if you're paying a gestor in Mexico 3 times what other gestores may charge for the same type of service, you know, that's a clear red flag. So you have to, in order to answer that question, it's important to understand the types of services that they are providing and to do a little bit of market research. What do other third parties charge for similar services, or to what do other companies in the industry pay? So it's a really hard question to answer. I would say the most conservative approach is to have a structure that relies on what in English we say is sort of time and materials. That means some sort of hourly fee for the time dedicated by the gestor, where the gestor can justify the amount of time that they spend, and you can look at a report or you can look at an email that describes the amount of time spent by the gestor, and you can look at it and say, yes, that amount of time looks reasonable. And at the same time, if the gestor is going to incur expenses, if you're going to allow the gestor to be reimbursed for expenses, that any expenses that are going to be reimbursed by the company are accompanied by a not just a receipt from, for example, the local authority, but an explanation of the amount paid and a corresponding receipt for any expenses incurred. So I would say hourly, a reasonable hourly fee, which you'll have to understand what is reasonable in the local market, and expenses that are substantiated by receipts and documents for any of those expenses.
Thank you.
Jeff, what's the basic tool set that you recommend for a company that is building this third-party program? Are questionnaires enough? Contracts? Both? Trainings? All of them? Due diligence? What are the? Of course, we are not going to recommend any tool on due diligence because there are a lot in the market, and this is not a marketing session. But what are the tool set that if you are doing this, you cannot forget to have these in place?
Yeah, I think you mentioned some of them, Gustavo, and I mentioned some of them when I went through the different categories. But you know, I think having a questionnaire, having a policy or some sort of protocol first in terms of what your approach is going to be is important. And essentially having a formalized approach that you can share with other people within the company so that they know when it is required to conduct due diligence. So having a policy or a protocol is important. Developing a questionnaire that you will use for the higher risk categories is important. Training, as you said, and training, we think about training for internal personnel. And certainly you want to train the internal people that are going to be expected to be users of the due diligence program, but also training for third parties that you believe present the highest risk. So I would say a training approach for internal personnel as well as your higher risk third parties. And I would also say, although I am not here to promote any commercial database, I would also say having access to some sort of database that allows you to efficiently run a background search to make sure that the third party is not on any sanctions list, is not currently under investigation, or hasn't been convicted for bribery or corruption. So having access to one of those databases, although it is an added expense, is an important part of having, I think, a robust diligence program. I will say just on that point, especially smaller companies or family companies where legal, compliance, procurement, where they're struggling to convince people to dedicate resources, the idea of buying a third-party compliance screening database sometimes can be difficult, can be a difficult conversation. I would encourage people to look broadly, because I think now there are more and more products that are available that are not as expensive as they once were, but also to use other relationships that the company has. I will say, we have many clients, I'm at a US law firm. We have many clients who say, we don't have this commercial database. Can you, as our US law firm, or can you, as an accounting firm we work with, can you run a quick search for this third party? And since we have access to do that, that's something that we can do in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Of course, that's not sustainable for a company that's going to be doing this with respect to a larger number of third parties. But for a company that is relatively small or is in its early stages and only has a handful or a number of high-risk third parties, there are certainly other resources available, including your service providers, that can help you conduct those screenings without going out to the market and investing that money on day one.
Jeff, I have another one that I think it's interesting. If you put yourself in the shoes of the business, of the commercial manager, for instance, what is the time frame that could be expected, or that would be, I think benchmark for this commercial manager to wait to get an answer for the due diligence of the third party? And is the process to be done, the question is, internal or external, and who has a say on approving or not, or disapproving this third party?
Yeah, excellent question, Javier. I think the programs that work the best that are those that involve commercial people in the flow of due diligence. And when I say involve, I mean making sure that whoever is the commercial sponsor of the third party, there's always going to be somebody from the business side who is either formally or informally sponsoring the third party, because for your own business, your own P&L, you want to hire this third party. I think the most effective programs are always those that treat the commercial person as part of the process. We always say the commercial people are the first line of defense. And that is true because they are the ones that have the most direct contact with the third party. Depending on the program, sometimes companies will have a multi-step program where you'll require the commercial sponsor to complete, say, an internal checklist to justify hiring of the third party, to show that they actually conducted some sort of analysis of the market for the compensation. And that's sort of a first step. And then once that they have completed that, then the legal or compliance department will send the due diligence questionnaire to be completed by the third party. Sometimes that's just too onerous. Sometimes it's not very practical. And so instead of that, the legal and compliance will send the questionnaire, but will rely upon the commercial sponsor to push the third party to complete the questionnaire and respond with the information that's due back to the company. I get phone calls all the time where a compliance officer says to me, the commercial person is pushing me to approve this third party, but we have not yet received the questionnaire. And my answer is almost always the same. Go back to the commercial person and tell them it's their responsibility to get the third party to complete the questionnaire. Because at the end of the day, that commercial person has to feel as though they have some involvement, some engagement in the process. If their own business is being rewarded or being benefited from this third party, they should be the ones with the ultimate responsibility for receiving the response back from the third party. How long to wait? That's a very difficult question to answer. Look, it depends on the complexity of the service. It depends on the complexity of the third party. I will say though, that if you have to keep pushing 3, 4, 5 times and you're still not getting any response, the lack of response is a red flag, right? I mean, from a compliance perspective, if you have to push a third party 5 times to get an answer to due diligence questionnaire, that should be perceived as a red flag. And that would give me some pause, both if I were the commercial person and a compliance person. Who should be involved, Javier, internal or external? Again, it depends on what resources are available internally. If there is an internal resource, whether you call that person a compliance officer, a legal person, a compras, procurement officer, if there is a designated person who is trusted and has the confidence of senior management and the board, I think much of this can be conducted internally. If there is not such a person internally, right, then obviously it makes sense to externalize conducting the due diligence. But sometimes I think it's a hybrid approach, which is, a lot of my clients, they have compliance officers, they have compliance teams, but for the highest risk third parties, a third party that is going to be interacting with the public ministry or public authorities, or where the due diligence questionnaire comes back and there is a red flag, that's where I think it makes sense to try to get some external support to make sure that you're thinking about the issues, as fully as you can, and that you're taking steps to mitigate. I'm not somebody who thinks you have to externalize every due diligence process. I think that gets to be expensive and it can be a waste of time and money. But I do think for higher risk third parties, there is value in taking a hybrid approach between internal and external resources.
Thank you, Jeff.
Jeff, and I'm going to merge a couple of questions that I have in mind. That what are the roles of internal controls? What are, in the day-to-day, you mentioned something about that this process doesn't end when you have the contract signed, so you have a follow-up. But what are the roles of internal controls? And what if that third party is the only one available in the region or in the country or in the city that you want to operate? And okay, it's an option to close your eyes and say, okay, take a deep breath and let's us and comment to God and say, hey, hopefully no one finds them. Or is there any kind of waiver from the regulator saying, okay, yeah, I understand that you are operating in risk areas? How do you see that in practical terms?
Yeah, in terms of internal controls, I sort of think about internal controls very broadly, which is, who are the functions that are involved in due diligence? We talked, Javier, in response to your question, we talked about senior management and senior directors setting the right tone, having a commitment, and certainly they have a role. Legal and compliance has a role in terms of developing and implementing the due diligence program. If there is a procurement department, making sure that compras or procurement is aligned with the compliance function is incredibly important, because sometimes what we see is there are disconnects or breaches or gaps where compliance is taking one approach on due diligence, but the procurement department is taking another approach. So, for example, there's a requirement at a company that due diligence be conducted on certain third parties, but from the procurement side, procurement has a different standard where procurement says, okay, well, if the services are below $10,000 or $5,000, then there's no need to go through the procurement process you can simply just hire the third party. And if those two systems are not calibrated or not aligned, you can get very significant gaps where third parties can be retained with, even if there's low dollar amounts or low peso amounts, those third parties can pose real compliance risk. So making sure procurement and compliance is aligned is an important control. We talked about commercial teams, other internal control functions, finance and administration. Making sure that the finance and administration teams understand what are the requirements for due diligence, are trained on those requirements, and that if a company is sophisticated enough that there are whether it's SAP or other ERP systems, that those systems are integrated and calibrated to make sure that no payments are made to third parties that have not been approved through the due diligence process. No payments are made to third parties that have been blocked through the compliance process. And perhaps that there is what I call a yellow light. Sometimes companies have a watch list, which means there are third parties that are not blocked, but are considered high enough risk. So they're on a list. And if there are payments that are contemplated to that third party, the finance department has to pause and has to consult with the general counsel or a compliance officer before moving forward with those payments. So financial internal controls are critical to your question, Gustavo. And then finally, other areas of internal control, or another area that I would highlight is internal audit. Making sure that if a company has an internal audit function, that part of the responsibility for internal audit is looking at the due diligence process. This is uncomfortable sometimes for compliance departments, because compliance departments sometimes view themselves as outside the scope of internal audit, and I think that's a bad mistake. I mean, I think having internal audit as part of a control function, looking at and helping to assess the due diligence process, can add value and can really contribute to process improvement.
Yeah, and then finally, perhaps before closing the session, what happens when you have that only third party?
Yeah, this happens a lot of times. I think if there's only one third party that's capable of delivering the services, my first answer would be, is that really true? You know, there are very few instances where although I have been told that many times over the years, there are very few instances where that is actually the case. So my first answer is, you know, press a little bit to make sure whether or not that is true. The other thing is, if that is in fact true, I still think it is important to conduct due diligence on that third party and to memorialize and document how the company got comfortable. You know, I think, you know, there are some pretty clear lines that a company would not want to pass if the third party is the only one, and the third party has a history and reputation for bribery and corruption. You know, you're engaging in a very, very high risk proposition. But if there's a gray area and it is truly the only third party, I would say run your due diligence process, document the rationale, and certainly include a monitoring function so that you can make sure that you are monitoring the conduct of the third party. And there are lots of ways you can do that. I know we're running short of time, but certainly diligence, memorializing your process and monitoring the third party are always good steps, but especially in situations where you have limited choices of who to retain.
Excellent. So we are getting to the end of our meeting today. So let's switch into Spanish. Gracias, Jeff, una vez más por tu participación. Muy valiosa. Gracias, Javier, por también la codirección. Y gracias, Nina, que nos está detrás de cámaras, ayuda con todas las logísticas de esta sesión. Gracias a todos los que participaron. Creo que tenemos muy buenos takeouts de lo que Jeff nos ha compartido. Básicamente, el programa de terceras partes, tomémoslo en serio, es mucho más que un mero due diligence. Es mucho más que simplemente hacer una búsqueda en Google o decir, bueno, es un tercero y no tengo nada que ver. Y es bastante más que solo hacer un buen contrato. Estamos trayendo a alguien a la familia, estamos trayendo a alguien a hacer negocios con nosotros, y no hay waivers, no hay una cuestión en la cual uno puede decir, bueno, el DOJ o la SEC va a entender que estamos en América Latina y que es un área de alto riesgo, los negocios acá son así, ellos van a entender. Sí, van a entender, pero no de la forma que nosotros queremos que entendamos. Así que, obviamente, Javi, no sé si querés agregar algo más.
No, de nuevo, agradecerle muchísimo a Jeff, creo que estuvo súper claro, muy interesante, muy didáctico, y bueno, y agradecerle a los participantes. Recibimos muchas preguntas, entendemos que haber respondido todas, pero si hay alguna que no hayamos respondido o que tengan, estamos abiertos por email o por WhatsApp a recibirlas y las respondemos. Así que excelente la jornada de hoy.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Jeff.
Gracias.
Gracias a todos.